The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. That's not just a line from John Stuart Mill. That's the closest thing civilization has ever had to a moral operating system. And if we're serious about building a world that is just, a world that is free, a world that actually earns the title of civilization, then that sentence right there has to be our root protocol. Because what Mill gave us with the harm principle wasn't a policy. It was a boundary, the outer wall of liberty, the last stop before tyranny. He understood something that most systems still refuse to admit. That the purpose of a civilized order is not to manage its people. It is to protect their right to self-authorship, unless their actions cause unjust harm to others. Let me say that again with the full gravity it deserves. Power is only justified when it prevents harm, not when it enforces conformity, not when it maximizes efficiency, not when it imposes order for its own sake. Only when it prevents harm. Because in an enlightened socialist framework, where we're not just talking about rights, but responsibilities, not just freedoms, but flourishing, the harm principle becomes more than a limit. It becomes a launch pad. It says to every human being, you are not a subject. You are not property. You are not raw material for an institution to refine. You are sovereign by default, by design, by birth. And unless your actions actively harm someone else, no one has the right to overrule your will. This is the philosophical core of yes unless harm. You do not ask permission to live. You do not require approval to transform. You do not need a license to become who you are. The answer by default is yes, unless harm. But here's the thing. Harm isn't whatever offends the majority. It's not whatever makes the powerful uncomfortable. It's not your feelings being bruised by someone else's freedom. Harm in this context must be specific, tangible, demonstrable. It's when your actions violate the sovereignty of another, when your freedom begins to dismantle someone else's capacity to flourish. That's the line. That's the ethics of mutual becoming. And that is why yes unless harm is not anarchy. It's not chaos. It's not do whatever you want. It is civilization. Actual civilization finally growing up. Because what we're saying is this. Every human being is a moral agent. Every life is a locus of potential. And the only just use of power is to stop coercion, not to enforce control. This is where the harm principle fuses with the doctrine of eudaimonia, because in Aristotle's terms, the highest good, the telos of a society, is to create the conditions in which human beings can flourish, not just survive, not just obey, but flourish in accordance with their nature, their reason, their creative will. Eudaimonia is not private happiness. It is public virtue. It is you, fully realized. And that can't happen under coercion. It only happens when the architecture of the world says yes, when the systems you live in default to consent, to trust, to freedom. Yes unless harm is how we engineer that trust, because it isn't just a rule for governments. It's a principle for infrastructure, urban design, education, code, culture, everything. A sidewalk says yes. A police state says no. A decentralized solar grid says yes. A fossil fuel monopoly says no. A gender-affirming healthcare clinic says yes. A gatekeeping bureaucracy says no. What do your systems say? Because here's the twist no one sees coming. The harm principle is not just a constraint on power. It is a design spec for liberation. It tells us how to build a world where the answer is yes by default, where flourishing doesn't require permission, only responsibility. You want to alter your body? Yes. You want to create art that disturbs? Yes. You want to live off-grid, raise your kids in a different language, explore life in ways your ancestors never dreamed? Yes. Unless harm. And when there is harm, then and only then power may intervene, not to dominate, but to protect, not to dictate the good life, but to defend the conditions that allow all good lives to emerge. This isn't just moral theory. This is the architecture of a civilization that earns its right to exist, because liberty is not a luxury. It is the soil in which flourishing grows, and the harm principle is the trellis that keeps that growth from becoming invasive, where my freedom doesn't strangle yours, where my flourishing does not require your suppression. This is the society that Enlightenment socialism promises. A world without coercion, a world without manufactured scarcity, a world where power is not hoarded, but bounded, where we stop asking what should be allowed and start asking what systems produce flourishing by default. So if you want a real moral test for a civilization, forget its GDP. Ask this: how many times do its people hear yes? And how often is that yes revoked without cause? Because every unjust no is an act of violence. Every unnecessary restriction is theft, not just of freedom, but of potential. We are not here to be managed. We are here to become. And so I'll leave you with this. If power is only justified to prevent harm, then let every law, every code, every wall and wire and word be rewritten with a single purpose: to protect flourishing, not control it. Because when the answer is yes unless harm, we don't just protect liberty. We engineer it. We infrastructure it. We make it so real, so embodied, so default that no tyrant can ever bury it again. This is what it means to finish the Enlightenment. This is what it means to build the mantle. This is what it means to live free.